games to other computer games. And I'm just kind of talking because he's setting up, and there's a mountain. It's a nice mountain.
Sorry.
Would it be better if I found quiet, or if I just
to
talked?
make that full screen issue?
Yeah.
Can you reach the full screen?
Anyway, I reckon the amount of time it's going to take for me to introduce Lee is about the amount of time it will take him to set up. So please welcome Lee Johnson.
Can you see it on the screen?
It's I'm not mirroring it. So.
Oh, right. How are you using presenter mode?
There we go, magic. Okay, so that kind of segues nicely into my talk because OAuth 2 is crazy, basically. And last year I was crazy enough to write, not the client side, but the server side. So I gave a talk on this module at YAPC last year. I don't know if anybody saw this talk. I know Tom did, but anybody else? No. So one of the things I said I would do is, well, this is a plugin for Modulicious, obviously, and I thought it might be quite useful for it to be usable for Dancer and etc. So I kind of threatened to split out the guts of the module into another module. And I did that earlier on this year. So there's now something that's reusable for other frameworks, which I think might be quite useful. But the reason I did that is because the original plugin only implemented the auth code grant. It only implemented one of the many OAuth 2 flows. And what I needed to do is I needed to be able to use the password grant, because the reason I needed to do that is because I wanted to write tests against this module I'd written. So we're kind of going down the rabbit holes now, unfortunately. But what I do, my approach to writing modules that interact with APIs is to now I tend to write an emulator, because, well, as we'll see, REST APIs can be quite fun to work with. I've written 2 other modules that interact with REST APIs recently as well, and I've kind of iterated upon what I've been doing with those, so I've figured out a path that works. I don't know if I'm sure people know Go Cardless. If anybody's worked with Direct Debit, you know how hateful that entire infrastructure is, so they make it great. It's fantastic. So I released that, and Fixflow is a property issue management platform, so they're quite good. So yeah, why emulation? Well, as I said REST, which is obviously that. And when I looked at the Mondo docs, I thought, well, these kind of look familiar. They look a lot like the Stripe docs, which look a lot like the GoCardless docs. And those docs, and those docs. And you kind of get the impression that they're constant. There's a lot of familiarity and similarity between all the REST APIs, but we know that's not the case, because when you start delving into the details, you see all these differences between implementations, and it's not just obviously their own service, it's how they're using the REST API. You know, they're saying, well, you could use plurals or singulars, or we're going to use headers for pagination or query params for pagination. And all these little differences mean moving from one module to the other, it's not going to be the same implementation. So just delving into some of the details a bit more, this is pretty sensible if you're okay. This is Mondo, and then you look at, I think this is Stripe, which, well, they use epoch time instead of ISO 8601, so that's fine. Go Cardless, which says, well, you can send a reference, but it has to be 10, except if you're sending this payment type, it has to be 180. And what happens if you send the wrong reference? Do you get a 400 bad request, or I don't know? And then this is a PayPal, sorry, which says we'll return your transactions, but only if you sent us a transaction for the API. You won't get all your other transactions, which is not very useful, I think, but that's the way they've done it. And Campaign Monitor, which will return all the endpoints are JSON apart from one, which is XML. And then this is Facebook, which I'm sure this is a typo in the docs, but they say you should send the auth amount and the auth currency as base64 UTF encoded strings, which I'm sure is a typo. Maybe that's the case, I don't know. And this is good. This is Twitter that follow the GeoJSON conventions apart from the longitude and the latitude being reversed. And this is one I was implementing with recently, and they argued, I suppose it was fair enough for them to argue that you shouldn't be using HTTP status codes to actually return errors, because they're the transport, not the actual service, and that's fine, but that's kind of the RFC doesn't really say anything explicit about that, and you kind of end up in that kind of state. with REST APIs. So that's fair enough. It's, you know, that's but I'm not interested in bike shedding because, you know, it's no point. My point is to write an emulator if you're working with an API, especially a REST API. And it doesn't have to be stateful, just mock response data. You don't have to rewrite their service. It's just a very simple and plain emulator. And write the tests against it because you're doing end-to-end testing effectively, which is where the power comes. That's a big thing, not having a monkey patch, which is often the case, having to overload LWP or whatever you're using with the transport. You just end up with very fragile tests. But the big thing is, obviously, you're improving your test coverage without having to call out to a third party. And if you're using CI, that's very, very, very useful because calling out to a third party will make your CI server fragile if you don't want to waste your time on that. So that's a little preview of the Mondo emulator that I wrote. It uses my OAuth2 server plugin to emulate the password grant, which is where we started, which I needed to do, and just some very simple routes to return just JSON. And that's how it runs. It starts up the emulator, grabs an access token, fires the end-to-end test, and kills the emulator. And just with the emulator, you get some pretty good test coverage. And obviously, if you add on top of that your unit tests, you're getting pretty close to 100%, which is quite good. So I don't know if you saw at the start, but this was kind of a one-sentence suggestion padded out to a lightning talk. If you do write a REST API, create a small emulator and give access to that. Giving access to a test server is great, but it's not all about, you know, there's usually not an SLA on that. I've been having this problem with one of the modules I've been writing, the test server. It's a moving target. So implementing something that's changing all the time. Something that just can be used locally, something very simple. And this is important, we kind of dog food it, because I think we write our APIs and we write our tests against our APIs, but we don't really write client code against our APIs. And I find this is quite useful. And obviously update it when you update your API docs. Depending on how you're writing your API, there's a lot of push to use these open specs now, so you probably heard, if not, probably will hear about stuff like Swagger and Open API, where you can generate your API from a config file, which will generate not just your routes in your module app or whatever, it will generate the docs as well. So they're always in sync. And what I'm planning to do is to write some patches for one of the CPAN modules that will actually emulate a response given a flag in the config file. So you can kind of put studs in there, which could be very, very useful in an emulator. And this is when I was developing the Mondo API. So I started, it was a bit small, but basically the first thing I wrote was the emulator. Then I wrote some tests and some unit tests and the classes to hit that. And it wasn't until, actually I hadn't received my Mondo card by that point, so I couldn't actually use their API, but it wasn't until that point that I received the card and I could get an access token and use it. And it turned out that all I needed to change, having written the emulator, was just one little thing where it turned out that their documentation was a bit out of sync. But it turned out in the end that they deprecated the password grant anyway, so this was all in vain. This is just to expand on it. I don't know if anybody's aware of Mondo, but they're kind of a modern bank. So they have all real-time, scary thought. This is one of the little apps I've written against their API. So basically I call their API, get us transactions back. It's all geo-coded. The great thing about them is it's almost real-time, so you could have this updating as soon as you make a payment, bang, it appears on the map. It's quite nice, which it is. Let's get this up in here. So that's it's still hacking away at it, but that's basically a little modulicious light app. I think it's less than 100 lines ago, 110 with a template. it's quite a nice little thing. But all that's come out right in the emulator, basically, because I couldn't test against it until I had my card. So it saved me a lot of time. So that's it, really. That's my one sentence suggestion. Write an emulator.
Does anyone have any questions for Lee?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, really interesting in this. So I've seen the patterns before. How do you compare this with just having a kind of recorder which is providing canned responses for testing?
I guess the point here is that you, as the provider of the API, to provide the emulator as well, so they're always in sync. I guess if canned responses is essentially emulation in a way, but it's depending how you do it, I guess. Okay.
It's more than one way to do it.
Yeah, basically. Cool. See, another question?
You've answered it.
Okay, good.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So, where am I? Yeah, like I said, I have some notes, but I don't have my notes with me, so I'm trying to mind read my notes. What we're going to do now is, before our break, we're going to do the lightning efforts. So if anyone's got something they'd like to mention about Perl, or something they'd like to say to the whole room, ever so quickly, it's got to be less than a minute, stick your hand up now.